Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to a couple of my post-apocalyptic recommendations. I have a few that are more survival and then I have a couple that are apocalyptic, yes, but they're more focused in another genre like fantasy or sci-fi. So let's get into the kind of underhyped books that I'm going to recommend. The first book is a young adult book and it is a typical survival story. So it is in the after, and this follows a character named Amy, and the cause for this kind of apocalyptic situation isn't necessarily like a disease, it's more a creature. So Amy is kind of on her own. These creatures are very adept at sound. So if you make so much as a whisper, they will hear you and they will come and find you and eat you and kill you basically. So Amy is kind of on her own. She's trying to survive and she ends up finding this young person called Baby, and Baby is like around 6 years old. And then they encounter like a civilization called New Hope. And the reason that this stands out to me as something I'd recommend is, yes, it does follow the general patterns of like a young adult survival book, but it also has an interesting premise with the two main characters. Amy and Baby use sign language to communicate predominantly, to the point where they are signing into each other's hands so that the monsters don't hear them talking to each other. And I thought that was just a really unique way to create, first of all, your monsters, and second of all, the relationship formed between your characters, because they really have to understand, first of all, the sign language, but also the gesture and the body language between each other really well in order to get along and survive in general. So that's why I'm recommending In the After, because I read this years ago now. It was one of the very first apocalyptic books that I picked up and I flew through it. I think it's a duology, so it's only this one and another one, and I really, really enjoyed it. It's a really bingeable series, to be honest, so that's why I'm going to recommend it. It's fast-paced, it's really bingeable, it has a unique premise of the sign language and the main characters, but it is a standard pattern in the sense that there are survivors and they find somewhere to go. So if you've read a lot of apocalyptic fantasy before, this might not be something new to you, but I would recommend it regardless because it's a little bit different and it has a little bit of a different flair. Next up is a book that I don't actually have with me, and I have seen it in a few other videos actually. It is called The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey, and this has a bright yellow sunny cover, so you don't really know that it is an apocalyptic book until you kind of start and realize in the first few chapters. So this book starts off with this young girl named Melanie, and Melanie is being kept in a cage and you don't know why. At the beginning of the book, Melanie is used to getting up out of her cot, going to her wheelchair and strapping herself in so that people can open her cage, come in and wheel her to class. And you find out that Melanie might not entirely be human, and the establishment that she's at is existing while the apocalypse is going on. And this apocalypse is very disease-based. So there is a fungus that's infecting people and taking over their immune systems, kind of like a parasite, but it kills their brain and takes over. So from that sense, with the whole outbreak and the survival, it is intricately explained. You don't go from a character waking up and there's an apocalypse happening, and you don't go from a character like In the After where they're before the apocalypse and then they're during the outbreak and then they're in the survival period. This is boom, you're straight into the survival period, but there are doctors and everything, and they kind of are tracking and trying to formulate some kind of way to combat this disease. And there is an outbreak and chaos ensues afterwards, and you follow the main character of Melanie, and because she's not entirely human, she's a very interesting character to follow, and you really investigate her morality and her way of interrogating herself in order to survive with the people that she may or may not have escaped with. So I really like The Girl and the Gifts for that reason. I really enjoyed the audiobook, and I believe the narrator is Finty Williams, and the way that she narrated the book, even though it was only her, I really connected with it. I really enjoyed it, and because her accent is English, I don't know what happened to my brain, but for some reason I was thinking in an English accent after I finished reading the book because I was just so used to listening to her voice. So it was a really engaging book. It was a really engaging read. It had ups and downs, and the writing was really easy to latch onto and understand. The sciencey parts with the description of the virus, sometimes that lost me a little bit, but you see it from multiple perspectives, so you can kind of clarify it in different ways of understanding, so you can kind of build your own picture as to what the virus is and what it does. So that's why I'm going to recommend The Girl with All the Gifts, even though I know it's not necessarily underhyped, but it's a book that I really enjoyed, and it's an apocalyptic book that I think more people should read. Also, there's a movie. Don't go and watch the movie, just read the book. I watched the first like 20 minutes of the movie and I didn't like it. I had to turn it off, but I really, really enjoyed the book. So take that as you will, probably read the book instead. Next up is a book that I've literally seen nobody talk about, and I read it recently this year and I fell in love with it. And it is The Book of the Unnamed Midwife by Meg Ellison. And this follows a character who is a nurse, a midwife, and we see her before the apocalypse situation starts, and she witnesses people with this virus that fall into a fever for like 7 to 10 days, and often they die at the end of this fever, but a very, very small fraction of the population end up surviving, and more men survive than women. So she's living in this world where men are dominant and where women aren't necessarily, and because of that power shift, she has to figure out how to get around safely, and whenever she encounters a woman, because they're quite rare, she tries her best to help them mentally and medically. And I found that because it was told from a nurse's perspective, and it's kind of in diary format, but also in a third person format. So you get to see the context of what's going on in that world and what's going on around her, but you also get to see her innermost thoughts. And she is disguising herself as a man in order to pass and not be, raped and murdered and assaulted and everything like that, captured even. And you see her kind of start to spiral as well, and she repeats notions of what she should be doing, like her body language or the way she cut her hair, and she's like, not a girl, not a girl, not a girl. So it's really interesting psychologically to see how she ends up and to see who she runs into. And there are multiple characters that she runs into in this book, and I really like the way that it ended as well. I think this is a really realistic take on anything that could be post-apocalyptic. I think that characters in here were really raw and really brutal, yes, and there is a trigger in here for obviously rape, sexual violence and gore and all that kind of thing. It's an adult book, it's quite heavy, but the way that it's written is really palpable. And again, I listened to the audiobook for this one and the narrator did an incredible job. I can't sing my praises high enough for this book. It was a book that was more quiet than action-packed, even though there were definite peaks in the action-packed scenes. There was a lot of character building in our main character as we see her grow and try and survive in this world. And there's also a lot of miscarriages in here. It's called Book of the Unnamed Midwife because women, if they're not killed by the virus, are often killed in childbirth because the birth rate for living children is very, very low. So this woman is trying to save the people that she can. It's just great. It is brilliant. I would highly, highly recommend it. It's probably one of my new favorites of 2020. So if you can get this somehow, library, audiobook, bookstore, I would highly recommend it. This is probably one of my new favorite post-apocalyptic books ever. And now that I've talked about my more post-apocalyptic books that are straight up apocalypse books, I'm going to move more into two other books, and they have post-apocalyptic elements in them, but they're more tailored to genres that are outside of that themselves. So the first one actually is a sci-fi, and it is Lifelike by Jay Kristoff. And this is a book that follows our main character Eve, and the world that they're in, basically it's been cooked by the sun. So it's very hot, it's very grungy, it's very grimy, and it's very steampunk as well. So it's a steampunk setting with Eve. She's trying to build this robot to fight in a ring fight or an arena fight, and the robot loses and there's a huge fallout for that. So she has to suffer those consequences. She also has a best friend named Lemon Fresh and a little robot, like personal robot, I guess, called Cricket. And he's kind of her morality, and Lemon Fresh is definitely her conscience, and Eve herself is fairly reckless. While these three are trying to find more scrap metal to rebuild this robot, they encounter a lifelike, and it is this boy who appears to be human, but actually is robotic on the inside. So kind of like a robot AI mixed with a real person with real thoughts and feelings. But this is definitely a gross and dirty setting in the sense that it just felt gritty when I was reading it, and it felt grimy. Just the way that Jay describes the world, it felt really tangible to me. So if you're looking for a book that's not necessarily all the doom and gloom and survival of the apocalypse, but has kind of a flair of that nature with a separate genre that explores a different story, I would recommend reading Lifelike. It was very fast paced. It was, again, very, very easy to digest. I read this physically rather than on audiobook, so the audiobook is probably great as well, but I really enjoyed this book. I really enjoy Jay's writing, and he tends to throw a few twists and turns either way, and literally on the last line of this book is the thing that threw me for 6 and was a complete twist, so that's what made me want to pick up the rest of the series. So I would recommend Lifelike by Jay Kristoff. And now we are on to my last recommendation. So like Lifelike, it is a book that is not primarily post-apocalyptic, although it has elements of that in it. And so the last book I'm going to recommend is by Mark Lawrence, and it's called Prince of Thorns, and this is the first book in his Broken Empire trilogy. So I read this a little while ago now, so the details aren't particularly fresh, but it follows a character in a fantasy setting. So again, it's not primarily post-apocalyptic, but it is kind of that vibe, and there's also a little bit of sci-fi elements in here as well, even though it's mostly fantasy. So it's kind of like if all these genres had a baby, that's what this would be. This follows Jorg, and he is a prince, obviously, Prince of Thorns, and he is basically on a revenge quest. He's going to confront all of his demons and his family and try and regain his position and essentially carve a future for himself, even though all these hands and all these people are turned against him. I don't want to say too much more than that, but I found this really, really intriguing in the sense that it's not like a standard fantasy. Jorg is definitely not a hero. He's not even particularly an anti-hero. He's just a guy that mostly does morally grey, dark stuff because he can and because he knows that it'll benefit him. And yes, now and again you can kind of empathize with him, and that's what makes it so interesting, because you know what he's doing and why, and sometimes you can go, I completely understand this direction that you're taking it, and I would do that too. But most of the time you probably don't want to go the same direction that he goes, because it involves a lot of murdering. So this was a very different fantasy that I read, but I really, really enjoyed it. And I, at this stage, have only read the first book. So I'm looking forward to rereading the first book because I did read it on audio, and because it does a few time jump kind of scenarios, I found it a little bit difficult to follow. So I'm going to reread it as a physical book so that I can read the rest of the trilogy, because I think this is going to be a really standout fantasy series to me because it seems so different and dark, and I'm kind of doing myself an injustice by not having finished it yet. So there you go, those were all of my kind of post-apocalyptic recommendations that aren't particularly overhyped. I hope you liked it. If you've read any of them, please let me know, because I love chatting to you guys in the comments. If you have any other recommendations for me, please let me know, because I love post-apocalyptic survival stories and I would love to find some more, so please let me know. Please recommend some. But thank you so much for watching again, and I will chat to you in the comments, and I'll catch you in my next video. Bye.